Jumping in the number 5 spot of the best budget gaming TVs is the TCL Q6, coming in at a price tag of $699.99 for the 65-inch variant. If at any point during the video you want to check out any of the 5 TVs in this video, there's Amazon links below for the US, UK, Canada, and international links. But let's talk about the Q6. Firstly, as far as price, I'm only gonna be listing the price for a 65-inch variant of all these TVs. Starting off with the Q6's ports, this includes 3 HDMIs, with all of them being only 2.0. This is the only TV on the list that does not have an HDMI 2.1, but there's a reason that you actually don't need that while still getting a high refresh rate of 120 Hz with all consoles, with the PS5 and the Xbox Series and PC. All right, so 3 HDMI 2.0s, 1 USB Type A, an Ethernet, cable, optical audio, composite in, and then a 3.5mm headphone jack. But now let's talk about the gaming performance itself. This natively hits 60 Hz and has variable refresh rate. Now, you might be thinking, well, then how does it do 120 Hz? Well, this uses resolution halving to get 120 Hz at both 1440p and 1080p. Now, this can be a fantastic choice, especially for an Xbox Series S that has a harder time hitting 120 Hz at 4K, but at 1440p, well, it can definitely hit those higher frames. So this TV could be fantastic for that. Using this with PC is also great at 1440p with low enough input lag to genuinely use this TV as a monitor. It's that low with that 120 Hz refresh rate. Now, a con here is ghosting is definitely the worst on the list, but in brighter scenes, it's pretty much a non-issue at all. Ghosting really only is apparent in those darker scenes, and this is because this is a VA panel, so you will get some color separation, some artifacting. It's not absolutely the worst in the world, but it definitely is noticeable in darker scenes. But if you're mainly playing games that are brighter and in brighter scenes, ghosting is literally a non-issue there, but something to keep in mind, you can't get everything for that price point. Now, as far as compatibility with consoles, you can achieve 1440p, 120 Hz, 4K at 60 Hz, and 1080p at 120 Hz with variable refresh rate and HDR on the PS5, but no HDR on the Xbox Series X and S unless you're doing 4K at 60 Hz. This is because the Xbox only supports HDR in a 4K resolution. Now, as for the sub-pixel layout, this is important if you're gonna be using this with a PC. This uses blue, green, red. So in Windows, if you're using a PC with this TV, you will have some text clarity issues. If you're just using it for gaming though, non-issue. Now, the panel type here, like I said, is a VA panel. So you're getting a great native contrast ratio and deeper blacks natively, but the viewing angles here aren't gonna be as good as something like an IPS-based panel. Brightness and SDR very consistently hits just shy of 500 nits. This is bright enough to make this a very enjoyable watching experience in brighter rooms, but the highlights here just don't pop as much as others on the list. HDR here is the exact same story. It gets slightly brighter, but highlights don't pop and the image just is a little bit more flat. Unlike others on the list, colors out of the box here were undersaturated and the gamma was too high, although this is fairly easy to adjust in the picture settings, and once done, this looks really, really good and nice, vibrant colors, but you really should go in there, adjust the gamma a little bit and adjust the saturation, just turn it up a little bit. If you don't want to do any tuning, if you're scared of that, you shouldn't be, it's really easy, but if you are, the others on the list do come better tuned out of the box. Now, for contrast ratio and local dimming, this has a great native contrast ratio, about 8,000 to 1. But unfortunately, this has no local dimming at all. So while the black level is very good for a native contrast ratio, in a darker room, you are still gonna go deeper blacks. They're not gonna be as inky of a black as some of the others with local dimming. Especially the number 2 and the number 1 spot have really deep inky blacks. Although the benefit is that you're not gonna get any blooming around like white text on a black background or anything like that. Because there's no local dimming, there's not really any blooming. All right, and lastly, let's talk about the OS. This uses Google TV, which is my favorite OS for any TV. Now, the processor on the Q6 isn't as fast as others on the list, so this does have some very minor lag when being woken up from standby, and it will very slightly lag when quickly navigating through menus or apps in the actual OS itself. Not a big deal, but something to note. But with that, let's move on to the number 4 spot, which is the Sony X85K, coming in at a price tag of $898 for the 65-inch variant. Do also keep in mind that this video should be out during Black Friday, and I've also noticed that most of these TVs are pretty consistently on sale, so again, check the links below for current pricing. That's just what they are released at. That's their release price, which we all know TVs a lot of times are on sale consistently. All right, now let's talk ports. Firstly, this has 4 HDMIs, with 2 of those being 2.1, going up to 4K at 120 hertz, with one of those 2.1 ports being the eARC port. You still have one 4K 120 hertz port if you're using that eARC port. You then have 2 USBs, one optical audio out, an Ethernet port, a cable port, and an IR in. Now, as for the gaming performance, this natively hits 120 hertz and has variable refresh rate, and again, has superbly low input lag. So you can definitely use this for PC gaming. Now, for ghosting, this does really, really well without much noticeable ghosting at all. There is some slight inverse ghosting, but during gameplay, it's pretty hard to notice this, especially to an untrained eye. It's pretty much on par with the number 1 spot, being slightly behind the number 3 spot, but this is because the number 3 spot has an IPS panel. Overall gaming performance here is very impressive. For compatibility, the X85K has full compatibility with the PS5 and Xbox Series X and S at 4K 120 hertz with variable refresh rate and HDR on at the same time, so no problems here. This TV takes full advantage of both consoles. The only thing to note is that this doesn't support 1440p and 120 hertz on Xbox or PS5. You can force 1440p, but that's gonna be stuck at 60 hertz. Now again, you can do 1080p at 120 hertz. This is kind of just a weird bug, but that is still something to think about. So if you're gonna be doing 1440p gaming, and you want 120 hertz, maybe you have a Series S, you might wanna look at a different TV. One last note, if you're using this TV with PC, this does use a sub-pixel layout of blue, green, red, so without software, again, you're gonna get those text clarity issues in Windows. Now, as for the panel type, again, like the Q6, this is using a VA panel, although a slightly more refined VA panel. Brightness and HDR here is good. SDR brightness is slightly brighter than the number 5 spot, but has much better consistency. This is bright enough to keep away most reflections and make the image pop, but when compared to the number 3, 2, and 1 spot, this is a little dimmer. This is by no means a dim TV though. HDR brightness here is okay, peaking at about 540 nits across the board, and that includes highlights. This makes for not as dynamic of an image as those highlights don't pop as much. Very similar, again, to the Q6, although slightly brighter. But now let's talk colors. Out of the box accuracy, while not perfect, the color temperature out of the box was pretty dang close to a 6500 Kelvin target, and overall was substantially better than the Q6. Now for contrast ratio and local dimming, this again has no local dimming, but this does have a native contrast ratio of 7500 to 1. Which is a bit less than the previous TV. So again, those blacks are not as inky as some of the others on the list, but black uniformity is incredibly good, and obviously there's zero bloom here. So while you don't get the craziest contrast ratio, this panel overall looks very, very polished without any weirdness going on, which is why this is in the number 4 spot. The only thing negative about this is that it definitely has a higher price point when compared to all the other TVs when you're taking into account what you get for the price. Now the OS here is again Google TV. It's my favorite OS, but unlike the Q6, there's zero lag here. But with that, let's move on to the number 3 spot, which is the Vizio Quantum Pro, coming in at a price tag of $699 for the 65-inch. Now coming in not super strong, the ports here are just okay. Having 4 HDMIs with 3 of them being 2.0 and only one of them being 2.1. Then you have one USB, an optical audio, cable, and Ethernet. There's no 3.5mm audio jack, which I do wish this had. Also to note that the eARC port is not the 2.1 port, so you can still hook up your sound systems without taking that 2.1 port, so that's still okay, but only one 2.1. All right, now let's talk gaming. This natively hits 120 hertz and again has variable refresh rate and an extremely low input lag like the other TVs on the list. Now for the PC, these advertises either 4K at 120 hertz or 1080p at a whopping 240 hertz. And that's legitimate. This thing you can game at 240 hertz at 1080p on a PC, and I will say it is awesome. Like the number 5 spot, this uses resolution halving, and visually it's very buttery smooth, just like a native 240 hertz panel, which is honestly amazing to use. On top of that, this has extremely low ghosting, the lowest on the list, and the best viewing angles, which is expected because this is an IPS panel. So you're gonna get a little bit better colors, and viewing angles when going to the sides are gonna be great, much better than a VA panel. For compatibility, this is fully compatible with the PS5, Xbox Series X and S at 4K at 120 hertz with HDR on and variable refresh rate on, as this does have FreeSync Premium Pro. And for those of you who don't know, Premium Pro means variable refresh rate with HDR on at the same time. The only weird thing here is that I couldn't get this TV to do 1440p at 120 hertz, so I'm not sure about that. So again, if you want that 1440p 120 hertz for like a Series S, you might want to look at maybe the number 2 or number 1 spot. Another cool thing if you're a PC gamer that wants to use these TVs is this has a sub-pixel layout of red, green, blue, or RGB. That means you're not gonna have any text clarity issues out of the box with a PC, so that's great. Now again, like I said, the panel is an IPS, but this has a quantum dot layer, increasing that color gamut. The negative side of this is because this is an IPS panel, you won't get as deep of inky blacks as other TVs on the list, but this still has vastly better viewing angles. So if you do want to prioritize viewing angles over those deep blacks, this might be something to go for. The other thing is that visually, most of the time, IPS panels just always have better colors, and that's true with this TV. VA panels, even if you're right in the perfect viewing position for a VA panel, an IPS is always going to win from a real life viewing experience. Brightness in SDR is a step up here, hitting over 600 nits of full screen brightness, with highlights here hitting just shy of 1,000 nits. This is fantastic for keeping away reflections, not to mention that it's very vibrant and a dynamic image that's honestly quite beautiful. HDR performance here is good, being slightly dimmer, hitting 570 nits of full screen brightness. That's still a lot of brightness. And up to about 900 nits in the highlights, which is on par with the number 2 and 1 spot. As for colors, while this is not perfectly calibrated out of the box, it's not wildly off at all. The big thing here is a very wide color gamut, and this is something you're gonna notice immediately over the number 4 and 5 spots. Colors are extremely vibrant, and playing games in HDR is so pretty. With that being said, let's talk about local dimming and the contrast ratio. Local dimming is fairly slow to respond to faster movements like when gaming, and the zones are just much larger, that it can be a lot more noticeable with those dimming zones coming on and off. So blooming is for sure noticeable on this TV. Now, contrast ratio without local dimming is pretty bad, but that's just because this is an IPS panel, and only 1600 to 1. That's not very good. But with local dimming on, this helps quite a bit, bringing this to almost 15,000 to 1, which is significantly better. This does on paper make this better than the previous 2 TVs, although again, that's only when you have local dimming on, and the local dimming just doesn't do that good of a job. It definitely helps, and it's still worth keeping it on, but it's not gonna be as good as number 2 and 1 spot. This is definitely a weak spot when compared to the other TVs on the list. Now for the OS, this is another weak spot. This OS is using Vizio's own system. It feels a little dated when compared to basically all other systems. It's not horrible by any means, and it pretty much has everything you want, but it does occasionally lag. Not super bad, but yeah, kind of a con, especially because Google TV is so good. But with that, let's move on to the number 2 spot. These 2 TVs, the number 2 and 1 spot, are so good. And this is the Hisense U7K. Coming in at a price point for $1,049.99 for the 65-inch, which sounds expensive, but it's consistently on sale, and it might be on bigger sales on Black Friday and coming up to Christmas. I personally got mine for under 800 bucks. Ports here are great, having 2 HDMI 2.1s up to 144 hertz, and 2 more HDMIs that can do 4K 60. This then has 2 USB Type A's, an optical audio out, 3.5mm audio out, a cable port, Ethernet, and a composite in. Now as for gaming performance, this natively hits 120 hertz and has FreeSync Premium Pro, which again means HDR and variable refresh rate on at the same time. And again, this has extremely low input lag. This is also helped with ALLM or auto low latency mode, which I believe all of the TVs on the list have, so don't worry about that. But yeah, very good input lag. Like the Vizio, you can also do 1080p at 240 hertz on PC, but not with variable refresh rate enabled. But you can also do 4K at 144 hertz and 1440p at 144 hertz, which is great if you're gonna be using this for PC gaming. Now, as for ghosting, there is some, but really, again, mainly in those black or darker colors against darker backgrounds. Outside of this, ghosting is not very present, which is great, but there's definitely more ghosting than the Vizio and the number 1 spot and the Sony, but it's not even close to as bad as the Q6, which still isn't that bad. It's still doable. This one's a lot less, but definitely is a little bit noticeable. Although I would not say that should be a deal breaker with this TV specifically, possibly on the Q6 if you're gonna be really prone to that, or if you're gonna be mainly playing games that are darker, maybe you're into horror or something like that. Now as for compatibility, this is fully compatible with the PS5 and Xbox Series X and S with variable refresh rate, HDR, 120 Hz, at 4K all at the same time. So 0 issues there. The sub-pixel layout for this is a blue, green, red. So text clarity issues on Windows if you're using PC will be a thing. But let's talk about the panel itself because this is where it gets very special. This is a mini LED lit VA panel with a quantum dot layer, which is what Hisense calls their ULED. Now, because of those mini LEDs, the local dimming on this is fantastic and the brightness is too. SDR brightness is hitting 700 nits of brightness with full screen brightness being between 500 to 600 nits, but it's very, very good. No problem with reflections or using this in a brighter room. Although this is slightly dimmer than the Vizio, and it's just slightly dimmer, the HDR is better and the local dimming is like completely not even comparable. This is far better. In HDR, full screen brightness gets a little bit brighter than SDR, but the highlights go all the way up to 1000 nits. In HDR, full screen brightness is probably gonna be around 650 nits. So this is very, very good. For an HDR experience, this is definitely going to be extremely nice. This makes the image very vibrant, the colors are beautiful, and the accuracy out of the box is quite good here, probably the best on the list. It was calibrated very, very well from the factory. But we've talked up the local dimming, let's talk about it. In my experience, local dimming set to anything but high doesn't really do that much. So set it in high and leave it because it's that good. This is definitely the most precise local dimming with the most zones out of any of the TVs on the list. That being said, it has a contrast ratio of about 45,000 to 1 with local dimming on, which is a very good contrast ratio. That's nice, deep, inky blacks, but it still can't beat the #1 spot, which is very impressive. With that being said, the bigger you go in screen size with this TV, the more local dimming zones you get. If you're going with the 75 or the 85-inch variant of this TV, you are going to get an extremely good local dimming experience with over 1,000 zones. That's where it gets incredibly good. For the OS, this is again using Google TV and there's no problems here. You get a little bit of lag the first couple of seconds you turn it on if it's been on standby for over 24 hours. But besides that, this thing is super smooth. But with that, let's move on to the #1 best budget gaming TV. This is the TCL Q7. Coming in at a price tag of $999.99 for the 65-inch, although again, consistently on sale. Check links below for current pricing. Now for ports, this has 2 HDMI 2.1s with one having variable refresh rate compatibility up to 144 Hz and 2 more HDMI 2.0s with one of those being an eARC. Then you have an Ethernet, cable, USB Type A 2.0, AV in, a 3.5mm audio out, and an optical audio out. How they did the ports is pretty much perfect. But let's talk gaming performance. Firstly, this hits 120 Hz natively and has variable refresh rate. Again, due to the extremely low input lag, this feels as good as a dedicated PC monitor. And again, you can PC game at 1080p at 240 Hz, 1440p at 144 Hz, and 4K at 144 Hz. Ghosting here is also very good, especially for a VA panel, and is definitely a step above the Hisense, although not quite as good as the Vizio, but that's to be expected, although ghosting should not be a concern. If you're gonna buy this TV, don't even worry about it. Overall gaming performance honestly blew me away. The image is what really sells this thing to me. It is incredibly beautiful. Local dimming is snappy even in faster games. Colors are beautiful. Input lag is superbly low, very little ghosting, and you get that high refresh rate goodness, especially on PC. If you're gonna be a PC gamer, so nice to have that 240 Hz. However, compatibility with the consoles, well, it has full support. PS5, Xbox Series X and S with variable refresh rate and HDR on at full 4K 120 Hz. That being said, on PC, if you have an NVIDIA card, this can't go over 120 Hz with variable refresh rate on, so that's something to keep in mind. For the sub-pixel layout, this is again a blue, green, red, so you're gonna have text clarity issues unless you download a software if you're on PC. But let's talk about the panel type. This is where it gets so good. This is a QLED, which is a VA panel with full array local dimming and a quantum dot layer to increase that color gamut. Brightness here is great, hitting around 550 nits of full screen brightness. In the highlights, this is going up to almost 900 nits, and that's just in SDR. I think that's why this TV's picture stands out from the others on the list. This keeps away most of reflections and maintains a very, very vibrant picture even in brighter times of the day if you have a lot of windows. I have a lot of windows in the living room where I test these TVs, and this is very impressive. In HDR, bright, colorful scenes look especially awesome on this TV. And in game mode, the display gets a little brighter while slightly less accurate, which is probably the way to go for gaming anyway, because we just want it to look good. Colors, like on the Vizio and Hisense, are absolutely awesome due to the quantum dot layer. This is one of the more beautiful TVs that you are going to view at this price point. It's very impressive, and it does feel like it's punching above its pay grade. But the black level and local dimming is where this really excels, and why this is actually one of my personal TVs that I'm keeping for personal use, as well as just buying them and reviewing them. Firstly, this has extremely deep blacks with full array local dimming set to high. This contrast ratio hits 80,000 to 1, which is the best on the list and is extremely noticeable. This has super deep inky black, similar to an OLED. Not quite that good, but pretty dang close to the visual experience. As well, the black uniformity is incredibly good, especially with local dimming on. That being said, as you go up inside, this has less local dimming zones when compared to the Hisense. So while the Hisense has about half as good of a contrast ratio, it's still very good. But that goes over 1,000 local dimming zones, the Hisense does, whereas this maxes out at 200 local dimming zones. The dimming zones still do a great job, and I personally like this slightly more than the Hisense just because those blacks are so deep. The image looks so amazing. Now for the OS, this is using Google TV again, zero lag. It's super, super fast. And one small note is that the remote actually is motion sensed, and it has backlit keys, which is a nice touch. None of the others have that, but it's a really nice touch. But again, if you want to check out any of the 5 TVs in this video, there's Amazon links below for the US, UK, Canada, and international links. Definitely click the links below. Check if they're going on sale this Black Friday or going up to Christmas. Even if you're watching this after that time, still check if they're on sale. A lot of these TVs are very consistently on sale. But this is a consumer tech review, and I'll see you guys in the next video.